Earlier this past week, after a full day of office work and meeting with individuals, I went over to one of the local restaurants to grab some dinner late in the evening and came across two parishioners who were out having date night, leaving the kids behind. I commended them for taking that step and then said, well, I'm going to go sit over here and let the two of you have your quiet time together. Well, after they had finished dinner, the husband threw a napkin at the back of my head to get my attention and called me over to sit down and chat a little while. After a good lengthy conversation, the wife said that she was being texted by their oldest daughter asking where they were, why they were taking so long. She said, well, we're talking to Father Matt. And then the response came, so you're going to be a while. It was actually really fortuitous that I ran across them in the midst of a date night, because as I was telling them, I was planning on preaching kind of about that necessity in the life of married couples this weekend. And while I was sitting down with them behind me, I was reading actually a good bit about what, a specific reason why I was thinking that. It comes from a little-known priest that I've known about for quite a while, and a movement that he had started that I've been involved in for quite a while, and what he would refer to as the little-known duty. And it comes actually from today's gospel passage. That little-known duty between husband and wife. It's not the opening line, hate one another if you want to be my disciple, but it's rather a means by way of growing ever more deeply in love with one another and living out the discipleship that our Lord calls us to. Back in the 1930s, late 1930s, Father Henri Caffarel, priest of the Archdiocese of Paris, was assigned to parish ministry. And in 1938, he had a young couple in their mid-20s, recently married, approach him with a request. They wanted some advice on how they might be able to live out the sacrament of holy matrimony all the more intently, with intentionality behind it, regarding really bringing in Christian discipleship into that. He encouraged them to gather a few other couples, and they would begin meeting a few months later. That initial small group of 4 couples gathered around Father Caffarel would lay the foundation for what today is known as Teams of Our Lady. It's an international movement, a lay apostolic movement, geared entirely at strengthening Christian marriages and helping couples to understand and to see that we're called to holiness in every walk of life, and that in the midst of marriage, you can become saints, and not just simply by the purgative way that some spouses put themselves through, purgatory here on earth. No, actually intently living out a life of holiness. By 1945, even through the Great War, Father Caffarel and these couples continued to grow and to expand into a network all around the Archdiocese of Paris, and he was writing letters out and had publications of his letters, of the thoughts that he was putting together, of the various endeavors that would enable couples to continue to grow ever more deeply. I've used his writings a good bit in some of my ministry in preparing couples for marriage, and it was in working with one particular couple that I came across, looking back in some research, came across the letter that ties into this weekend's readings. And so it's been about 6 months that I had this marked on my calendar. You're going to preach about this on this weekend. So in a letter from 1945, Father Caffarel began by saying, in a century of so much disorderly activity and dizzying speeds, 1945, mind you, disorderly activity and dizzying speeds. I wonder what he would think of today and what we experience as families today. Well, he says, in the midst of all of this, there is a duty that is very little known, and yet Christ alludes to it twice in Luke 14. It is the duty of sitting down. What he's alluding to is the parable that our Lord uses. Jesus says, which of you, wishing to construct a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough for its completion? Or what king, marching into battle, would not first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing with 20,000 troops? As I read that, my mind turns to some of the football scores I saw from yesterday and wondering if some of these little teams that are about the size of Tiffin University going up against the likes of Alabama aren't wishing to have that little sit down and say, can we really do this? But then again, I think they are, because the almighty dollar is what speaks. But this thought of sit down and take account of what's going on in your lives. Father Caffarel goes on, he says, I do not think I am making a rash judgment when I say that even the best Christian couples, that is, those who never break the duty of kneeling down to pray together, often commit the transgression of not sitting down. Because consider, and I find this with so many of the couples that I am preparing for marriage, when you were young, when you were thinking about marriage, you talked an awful lot, and you talked about the future. You talked about what you were going to build together, and whether or not you were of like mind. Father Caffarel would ask, he says, okay, you did that once before, but now that you're living your married life, do you sit down together to examine what has been accomplished? To rediscover the ideal that had been gleaned in the start? To consult the master architect? It's unfortunate, but I think he is right in saying that there's too many of us that just simply don't do that often enough. He says, I know all about the objections and the difficulties, but in truth, and I've seen this myself with my own eyes, I know that the house one day will fall down because it has not been properly taken care of. For a couple who does not take the time to stop and reflect, material and moral disorder very often slips in and settles down. Routine begins to take over family prayer, meals, and other family rites. Conjugal unity is cracked. It's a great danger that he's speaking of. If we're not sitting down and talking one to another, it's very easy to start very close to each other, and over the course of time, just little by little, we drift further and further and further apart until one day we are so distant from each other that we don't even recognize and know the person with whom we've been living for years. And it's no wonder that individuals say, I have fallen out of love. It's a great danger. So how do we avoid this danger of being so very far apart? Well, here's the means of staying very united. Take your calendar and schedule the time. Just as we would schedule anything else, schedule the time to spend husband and wife alone together, and make it a considerable length of time. 2 to 3 hours, and let nothing get in the way, because it is sacred time. It is sacred time. So what do? There's a video that I show with the married couples that talks about doing date night in this very way, and some have said that one of the presenters talking in the video says, I was talking with a friend and I tell them that we go on a date night every month, and they said, well, what do? There's only so many movies that you can go to see. Well, if that's all we're doing, we're obviously not talking together, right? That's good to spend some quality time. But here's what Father Caffarel advises, or that he gives as a good means or a good way of spending this time. He says, first of all, pray. Pray for a very long time. And do not be in a hurry. And when you pray, pray like this. Pray aloud, spontaneously. Now, as I've worked with various groups, various teams, this is one of the endeavors that he would write about in other places, calling it conjugal prayer, married couples praying together. And the couples that I've worked with have always said that this is one of the most difficult endeavors that Teams of Our Lady asks for. Because if we think about this, if we're doing it properly, it should be somewhat uncomfortable. Because in our prayer, if we're praying authentically, we're not just simply, talking about what we're thinking, or even about what we're feeling, but we're getting to the very depths of who we are. We're not stopping with the head, or even at the heart. We're going right to the very core, to the soul. And we're opening that up before God. And in that way, we are most vulnerable before Him. And so when we invite another individual into that, it's a level of vulnerability that I think many of us are a little timid about. So he says this form of prayer, yes, very difficult, but it draws hearts miraculously together. In this way, having entered into the peace of the Lord, you now tell each other what is in your heart, your thoughts, your anger, your confidences, apprehensions, desires. These are not easy and often are not wished for during active and noisy days. And yet, it is dangerous to seal within one's heart these things because, as Father Caffarel says, silences become the enemies of love. Silences become the enemies of love. When we're not talking about what's going on within us, that's what happens when we begin to drift so very far apart. It becomes the enemies of love. Do not stop with yourselves nor the worries of the day, Father goes on, and he says, but make a pilgrimage. Make a pilgrimage to the source of your love. Reconsider the ideal that you saw when you first embarked sprightly upon that road together, and renew your fervor. Then, return to the present and confront both the ideal and the reality. Are we living up to that ideal? And do an examination together as a couple. Notice he says, not as individuals, examine your conscience, but examine your conscience together as a couple. That way, we can bring about change together and saying, this is what we need to do. Going to the cause of the evil that might be creeping in between us after having really diagnosed it. This can be really difficult, but how very fruitful. It's like taking up that cross and following Christ. Now, Father would go on and he would say to couples who have families, who have children at home, he says, why not spend a few moments also in meditation upon each of the children, asking the Lord, according to his promise, to put his eyes into your heart, so that you might see your children as he sees them, and that you might lead them according to his will and not your own. Finally, and above all, ask God, or ask yourselves, if God is the first one served in your home. Is God the first one served in your home? I know for many of our young families, there's a lot of things that draw us away, a lot of things that get into first place. That is what becomes our God if it is pushing God behind. Is God the first one being served? And so, as we hear our Lord today encourage us to sit down and to calculate the cost, We are encouraged ourselves in whatever vocation we live, in whatever walk of life that we are, to do that very thing consistently. I would say at least once a month, to sit down and to spend the time in the presence of the Lord, taking up that assessment and renewing the fires of love that were first kindled perhaps some years ago, so that we might build up in our families ourselves as holy disciples, holy families, and holy vocations to the greater glory of God and our church.